1. And so we're going to be looking at John chapter 1 this morning as we jump into our Advent series. Now, I used to work retail. I worked at Target, and so this time of year was a busy time of year for me and for my coworkers. And one of the things I remember doing, like setting up Christmas displays and that kind of stuff, which is, in my opinion, it was one of the worst displays to set up because Christmas ornaments are really small compared to like big boxes of stuff that you can just set on a shelf, and so you have to fill up all these things. But one of the things I hear from people walking around the store, I hear from people now that I work with, it's always like before Thanksgiving, it's like, can we just get through Thanksgiving before stores start setting up for Christmas? Let's get through Thanksgiving first. Well, we're through Thanksgiving. All right, that week is come and gone. And so now we can focus on Christmas. And this is good news for the church. All right, this is one of the two major celebrations that we have as a church, that we look forward to the coming of Christ, that Emmanuel, as we just sang about, that God was with us, that we'll look at this morning. And so looking forward to that, and for us looking back, but with that same anticipation, trying to put ourselves in the place of those shepherds that were there, of the people of Israel that were there, that were longing and waiting for a Savior to come. And of course, Easter, that we'll celebrate here in a few months as we look not just to the cross where Jesus died, but to an empty grave where He rose again, conquering sin and death. And so these two major holidays within the church, like we even have a word for the people who only attend on those days. I don't know if you know this word. They're called Christers, right? The Christmas and Easter Christians. And so people just kind of know in our culture that, hey, there's something important about these 2 days. So if I'm going to attend church twice a year, it's going to be Christmas Eve and Easter Sunday, right? And even in this time of year, just in our culture, we have this idea of miracle starts to pop up. That maybe it's kind of not there, it's disappeared the rest of the year, but we start thinking about miracles this time of year. And so we have movies like Miracle on 34th Street, right? And so we know there's something about this time of year that's special, that should invoke some sort of hope and joy in us. And the other side of that coin is it's also the time of year where people really struggle with depression, and suicide rates go up and those kind of things. And even that, it's kind of a response, right, to there's supposed to be joy and I don't experience it. There's supposed to be hopefulness and I'm not experiencing that. And so it kind of drives into the other direction. But there's this cultural phenomenon that we know miracles should take place. We even say things like at Christmas, anything is possible. People who are jerks the rest of the year are nice at Christmas, right? People start holding the doors for you. You are going to speak to people in the next few weeks that normally you would not speak to. All right, you going into the mall or Walmart or Martin's or wherever it is, normally you would walk right by them and not speak to them and probably avoid eye contact if possible. Right? But at Christmas, what do? Merry Christmas. Right? There's something in the air around this time that things are different, and we know that things are different. It's not wrong. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, I think it's kind of a trace memory in our collective unconscious in our society that there's something special about this time of year. Miracles are possible at this time of year. But what I want to submit, and one of the things that we look forward to this season as the church, is that Christmas is not just about miracles in general, but it's about the miracle on which all other miracles hang. It's the grand miracle. It's Emmanuel, God with us, the incarnation of Jesus, of God taking on flesh. And so let's look in John chapter 1. We're going to read the first 18 verses. John chapter 1, verses 1 through 18. It says, you listen to John introduce Jesus to his readers. Let's just take a minute to stop and think about what the purpose of John's writing was. He actually says it in the end of his letter. He says that you would believe that Jesus is the Christ. and by believing you would have eternal life in his name. And so John has a very clear purpose as he writes this book. He wants to introduce Jesus as who he is. And listen to how he starts off his letter. Verse 1, it says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." Now the Greek word there for word is logos or logos. It's the same word we get logic from. That's going to be important for us as we continue to read through this morning. But he says, "In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John." Now he's not talking about himself, but he's speaking of John the Baptist. Verse 7, he says, "He came as a witness to bear witness about the light, that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but came to bear witness about the light." Verse 9, "The true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. John bore witness about him and cried out, 'This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks before me, because he was before me. For from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth come through Jesus. No one has ever seen God, the only God, who is at the Father's side. He has made him known." So here's the important thing for us to understand as we go into this season, looking towards Christmas and the holiday celebrations and maybe the time with family and the gifts and the presents and all that goes along with this season. That we want to encourage us to focus in on why do we celebrate Christmas. Because if we don't get what we're talking about this morning, if we don't believe what we're talking about this morning, it really makes no sense to celebrate Christmas at all. But if we understand, if Jesus Christ is God come in the flesh, all of Christianity hangs together on this one idea. If Jesus is really God in the flesh, then miracles really are possible. That we can have purpose, that we can have hope in this life because the miracle of the incarnation has happened. But if Christmas has no point outside of family celebrations, if Jesus Christ is not God come in the flesh, then none of Christianity coheres and miracles aren't even possible. Everything hinges on this in John 1:1, this idea of God taking on flesh. In fact, over the next 3 Sundays and then Christmas Eve, we're going to study through Colossians chapter 1. It's going to be kind of our Advent series as we study and get to know who is Jesus. We're going to look at Jesus as our gospel, Jesus as our God, Jesus as our King. And so as we look at those things over the next few weeks, we need to understand what we'll talk about this morning as John introduces Jesus to the world. Because really, if you consider that the average person likes Jesus. Like I'm not talking about the average Christian, just the average person in the world. They like Jesus. Jesus is a pretty good guy. most people would agree with that. The average person thinks he was a good person, maybe a good teacher, maybe a great example for us to go by. But when we begin to press into other articles of the faith that Christianity holds dear, people start to get a little bit nervous. For example, that Jesus Christ did great deeds and miracles. Not just great deeds. It wasn't just he was a good guy, but he actually did miracles, like told people to see who had not been able to see for their entire life, and then they could see. That's pretty impressive. Right? The guys who had not been able to walk, he tells them to get up, take their mat, and walk. And they get up, take their mat, and walk. That's pretty impressive. Amen. There's a guy who had been dead for a few days, to the point where they said, he is stinking. Okay? It wasn't like Jesus came up, did some CPR, and things were okay. I mean, the guy was starting to rot. And Jesus says, come out of the grave. And he gets up and walks out of the grave. That's beyond, he's a pretty good guy. Right? Like, I know some pretty good guys. None of them have I ever seen call someone out of the grave. Amen. It starts to make us a little uncomfortable maybe, though. Not only that, Jesus rose from the dead himself. Not only that, but that Jesus' claim that his death can liberate us today. Even though we live 2,000 years later in a completely different world, Jesus still claimed that he was the only way to God. Jesus' call on our life is to worship him. Not to just follow his example, not to just study his teachings, though both of those we are called to do, but ultimately to worship him. So when you come to all these articles of the faith, and maybe hands start to get a little bit clammy, but we have to understand that all of this really makes perfect sense. If we're going to put our trust in it, if Christmas is going to have a point, then this idea of Jesus being God in the flesh actually makes sense. If he is, then we're in this situation. Miracles are logical. Why? Because miracles make perfect sense because of God. He's the creator of nature. And so if you create something, you can use it how you will. And so miracles make sense if God is a creator of nature. The resurrection makes sense because God is the author of life. Not only that, but the idea that Jesus' death can liberate even now, because if Jesus was God, then his death is a death of infinite value. Because an infinite God would have infinite value. If Jesus is God, and by the way, no other founder of any major religion has ever come close to making that claim. If he actually is who he said he is, then of course it makes sense that he would be the supreme way to know God, to be made right with God. See, if Christmas has a point, then all the rest of the articles of Christianity make perfect sense. But if Christmas has no point, then nothing else has a point in Christianity and our faith. If Christmas is not true, then there's no possibility of miracles. But if Christmas is true, then we can see miracles happening day after day after day in people's lives. The reason that it's so critical and important to see what the Bible says about what happened at Christmas is because it is the grand miracle. So if you look at verse 14, John chapter 1, verse 14, he says, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us." I mean, that's what we celebrate at Christmas, right? That the Word has become flesh. And he's dwelling among us. Remember in verse 1, it says that the Word was God. And so it's this idea of God taking on human flesh. But then look at what else it says in verse 14. He says, "And we have seen his glory, glory as the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth." First, I want us to look kind of at some of the components of this great miracle. Really, two points, two sides of this great miracle that we've already mentioned this morning. One is that Jesus is God. The first miracle, the first part of this, is that Jesus is really the Word, and He was really flesh. And so let's look at the first half, that Jesus was God. The word that John uses here, this idea of logos, it's a Greek word. Like I said, it's where we get the idea of logic from, or our word for logic. In a lot of Eastern religions, kind of mystery religions, there's a very Eastern view of God. God is a life force. He is a energy maybe that's there. And so it would be possible for people to come along and make statements like, I am God. Like Buddha or Krishna may claim to have kind of come to a certain point, evolved to a certain point, where they have such a strong, high degree of God consciousness that they are now avatars. They are in some ways incarnations of God, in the sense of manifestation of what God would be like. But that's not what John's talking about as he talks about the Logos. Not only that, but in Western religions, the Greek religions, it was believed that gods like Zeus or Apollo occasionally got like a 7,000-year itch and would fall in love with people on the earth, and they would come to earth and they'd pair up with someone and they'd have children that were kind of half God, half men, like Hercules or Achilles, people like that. And therefore, it could be said that they were gods. Sometimes they were even called gods or demigods. But John is saying, look, I don't mean that either. And he wants to clarify who the Word is. He defines the Word up in verse 1 of chapter 1. 3 statements that he says about the Word. In the beginning was the Word. So statement number 1, that in the beginning, this Word, this Logos, existed. And so it's a beginningless Logos, a beginningless word. It's not something that came into being, but it was there at the beginning of all time. So we can't go into any other religions and kind of get that idea of someone who maybe claimed to have a God consciousness or claimed to be the son or the daughter of a God who could say that they had no beginning. But John, as he introduces Jesus, he says, in the beginning was the Word. It was already there. No one created the Word, because in the beginning, when things were getting created, the Word was already there. In fact, John goes on to say that He was the instrument of creation, that nothing was made that He didn't make. And so as we look back in Genesis 1, it talks about God speaking creation into existence, that God's Word is causing things to come into existence. And in John 1, we have the Word who is creating things. We have consistency throughout the Scriptures. Not only was the Word beginningless, but the Word is a person. It says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. He's a person, but a person without beginning. And then finally, John says, and the Word was God. That this Word that he's talking about, this Logos that he's talking about, that it was God. And we see in verse 14, as he transitions and kind of tells us who he's talking about, and the Word became flesh. One of the great problems for people is this idea of the Word becoming flesh, that Jesus was actually God, the second person of the Godhead. If Jesus Christ had been like any other founder who had said, I can point you to God, then somehow all religions can share a piece in this pie of getting to God. But Jesus didn't come and say, I can point you in the direction of God. Jesus actually claimed to be God. Jesus came and he said things like, I and the Father are one. Before Abraham was, I am. Notice he didn't say before Abraham was, I was. I am. This is a connection back to as God told Moses his name in Exodus chapter 3 and 4. Then he said, who am I going to say is sending me to set free the Israelites from Egypt? And God says, I am that I am. Tell him, I am has sent you. And so when Jesus, before Pilate, says, before Abraham was, I am, he is making a direct connection to the fact that he is God. He claims self-existence. He's the beginningless person. Jesus Christ forgave people of their sins. Do you realize what that means? Like, he forgave people of their sins against a holy God. Now, many of you know, I've got two kids. One is 12, the other is 9, and they get along most of the time. And I grew up with no siblings. I'm an only child, and so it explains a lot about me, I know. But, as an only child, I'm not used to the whole sibling fighting thing. It's weird to me. Right? That you would just punch somebody because you felt like it. That's a weird thing in my life. Like if I punched somebody in my house because I felt like it, I was in quite a bit of a trouble because it was either my mom or my dad. Right? And Dad took care of it either way. So, it's just weird to me that would be the case. But that, if my son walks up and punches my daughter, I cannot forgive him for punching her. Why? The offense was not against me. So I cannot offer him forgiveness for something he did to her. Only she can offer him forgiveness for the offense against her. So when Jesus forgives people of their sins, the sin is an offense against a holy God. It wasn't as if people came up and were just offending Jesus in person and he said, well, I forgive you, go ahead. Other people, see how I forgave that guy? Follow my example. When people hurt you, forgive them too. No, he's making a claim that he has the authority to forgive sin against a holy God. Well, who is the only person that can forgive an offense against God? It's God. So when Jesus forgives sin, there's a claim. When Jesus went through everywhere in his ministry forgiving people of his sins, what he was saying is all these sins are against me. No matter what you've done, they're really against me because I'm your creator. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and nothing was created except through the Word. Jesus was claiming to be God. If this isn't true, if Jesus isn't really God, nothing else in the Bible and nothing else in the Christian faith even makes sense. It all falls apart. If on the other hand, he is, if he's made of the same stuff, if he's the only begotten of the Father, then there is nothing we can't expect him to be able to do. There is nothing that is too great for Jesus to accomplish. Anything is possible if he is in our lives. If he's our leader, if he's our master, if he's our friend, if he lives in our hearts, then miracles are possible even in our lives. But that's not the only part of the grand miracle. It's not the only part, not just that Jesus was God, but that it's also true that he was God made flesh. Verse 14, that he took on flesh. The Apostle John is talking very personally and historically as he gives this information, as he sets up and introduces Jesus to his readers. He says, that's the personal part, we have seen his glory full of grace and truth. John's talking about something that he had personally seen. He says, we have seen him full of grace and truth. That John had seen this guy take on flesh, this God take on flesh. He'd seen him living day in and day out. Do you ever wonder or think about how incredible it was for Jesus that anybody believed that he was God? Right? I mean, just think about it. Now, in an Eastern religion, maybe some people, he could gain a little bit of a following. In a Western religion, he may have been able to gain a little bit of a following in those two camps we already talked about. But he came into Jewish culture. The Jews knew who God was. They had an understanding of who God was. And for a person to come along and say that he was God and to get Jews to believe him and follow him, that is an incredible feat. And John's saying, look, the reason that we believe him, the reason that we follow him is because we've seen him. We have seen God in the flesh. These weren't just kind of people from afar that heard about Jesus. These are people living with him day in and day out. Now, if I were to come to you this morning and say, I've got some news I want to just let y'all all in on. I'm God. All right? I don't know why you're laughing. All right? No, really, I'm God. All right? There are some people in my life that you could interview. Okay? So if I were to come to you and say, you know what, I just want you to know I'm sinless. I'm perfect in every way. Okay? Most of you already know, like, I've been around you long enough. All right? Never once crossed my mind that maybe you were God. But there are people in my life you could interview. You could go to my wife, and she could tell you about the times when I say I'm going to do something around the house, and it doesn't get done for several weeks or months or years. Right? Right, and so she could be like, no, the perfect thing, that doesn't match up. That seems like he doesn't always keep his word. Right? She could tell you about the times when I'm lazy and just don't feel like doing stuff. Right? She could tell you about the times when our kids were little and they were crying and she thinks I was faking being asleep so I wouldn't have to go up and go get them. I'm standing by that I was really asleep. But she could tell you about those times. Right? And so there's people who are close to me that could vouch for the fact that he's not God. But Jesus, it was the people who were close to him that said, we've seen it. We've seen this guy do things that we've never seen before. We've seen this guy act in ways that we've never seen before. They saw virtues in Jesus that had never been combined in one person. You have here tenderness without any weakness. Strength without any heavy-handedness. Humility without any timidity. Firm, unbending, unyielding convictions, and yet utterly approachable. Passion without prejudice. Power without insensitivity. Never a jarring note when they looked at him. Never a false step. Never. John says, we've seen the glory of God full of grace and truth. You know, when you look up at the sun, maybe this afternoon, I don't know what the weather's going to be, but if it's a nice sunny day, and this is even more true in the summer months, but if you look at the sun directly, right, you can only look at it for so long. It hurts, it's painful to look at the sun. In fact, we tell our kids, don't look directly at the sun, you know, because kids aren't very smart, and they haven't figured out that, like, if that hurts, I should stop, right? And so we tell don't look directly at the sun. It's going to hurt your eyes. But if you look at the sun with a filter, then you can start to see the details of the sun. You can kind of see the fire that's dancing around on the sun. You can start to get an idea of what the sun looks like by looking at it through a filter. What John is saying, he says, look, no one's ever seen God, because if we looked on God in all of his holiness and all of his glory, it would be too painful. It would hurt our eyes to see God in all of his glory. But we have seen Jesus. We've seen God through the filter of human flesh. That it's something that we've actually seen and lived with. That he would say things like to the sea to be still, and it actually stopped moving. He would call people back to life from death, and they listened. John is saying, look, we've seen the miracle that is Christmas, that God has taken on flesh. Emmanuel, God is with us. All that's very good and maybe even exciting, and maybe you can even see that as a miracle, but maybe thinking, what difference does it make to me? How does this hit where the rubber meets the road? Like, what does this actually have to do with my life? And John's answer would be that all the difference in the world. This is the source of every other blessing. Every grace upon grace upon grace. John says, from the fullness of his grace we have received one blessing after another. Grace upon grace. How many blessings can I pull out for us to consider today? I want us to consider 3 blessings today from the incarnation. From if Jesus really is God and he really is a man and he's the incarnation of those 2 things coming together. That first, if Jesus is God become flesh, if Christmas has a point, if Christmas really is true, then we have an end to the problem of meaning. Or maybe I should say the problem of meaninglessness. So this is one of the things that John is dealing with as he introduces Jesus as the Logos. Now, for centuries, Greek philosophers had argued over the Logos. We understand, again, as logic, and so it's the same, this rationale. What is the rationale? What is the purpose of life? And so as John writes to his audience, it's intentional that he's using this word, this idea of rationale, of purpose, of meaning, of logic, that he uses this to introduce Jesus. As they ask the question, what is the meaning of life? John introduces Jesus as being him. Now I want you to imagine if you were living in a world without modern conveniences. All right, and that may be hard as we sit in here this morning with a projector and a keyboard and speakers, but just imagine no modern conveniences. Right? And for Christmas this year, you get a modern coffee maker. All right? Now, for most of us, if you're a coffee drinker, it's a pretty simple machine. You put coffee in, you put water in, you turn it on, coffee comes out, right? It's not too complicated. But if you'd never seen one before, you had no idea what this was for, I mean, think of how you would look at this for a second. I mean, it's got a tail. Why does it have a tail? Right? The tail is forked on the end. Probably means it's evil. Okay, because things with forked tails are never good. Okay? Maybe you begin to look at you turn it upside down and everything falls out, so you realize like, okay, well, it has to go this way, like I'm figuring that out. And you start to figure some things out about it, but it really has no meaning to you. It might be a paperweight. Could be something you make lemonade in. I mean, you really have no idea. It has no meaning for you. And that's kind of where the Greek philosophers were coming from when they looked at this idea of meaning or rationale in life. And they said, look, if we could figure out what the rationale of life is, what the meaning of life is, then we could be happy and fulfilled in this life. We would have purpose in our life. So they spent centuries going around trying to figure out what is the meaning of life. What is the Logos? And they kind of come up with this conclusion. It's very similar to the conclusion that Solomon came up as we read through Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament as he was trying to find the meaning of life. He says that there is no meaning to these things. There's no way around it. Life is meaningless. And so 2 groups kind of came out. By the time that Jesus comes on the scene, we see 2 groups of Greek philosophers who have come out of this way of thinking. One is the Stoics and the other is the Epicureans. And so the Stoics had come to this conclusion: life has no meaning, and therefore the thing for us to do, the only thing that we can do in life is try to be as noble and as strong, as controlled, and as morally good as we can be in the face of meaninglessness. So that was kind of one way of thinking as you go through life. Try to be as good as you can in the face of nothingness. The Epicureans took a different route, and I think probably if I was in the same boat, I would be more along the Epicurean way of doing things. They said the same conclusion: life has no meaning, but because life has no meaning and there's no absolute truth, the best thing we can do is go out and try to have as much fun and enjoy life as much as possible. Now, I don't know where you are. You're probably a better person than I am. But if I'm in their shoes thinking those are the 2 options, I'm going with as much fun as possible, not so much be as strong and as good as you can. Right? But those are the 2 camps. Think about it for a second. Does that sound too much different than the world we live in today? The goal of life is to be a good person. I mean, that's the end. That's what we're striving for. Be as good as you can. Do as much good as you can. Or, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Have as much fun. Enjoy life as much as you can. Those two camps that were there in Jesus' time are the same two camps that are there in our time. And John comes on the scene in John chapter 1. He says, wait a minute. You've been looking in the wrong places. You've been looking in your books. You've been looking to try to make this rationale on your mind. He says, there is a logos. There is a rationale. But the logos is not an abstract principle to be discovered. The logos is a person to be known. And that person is Jesus. It's a cataclysmic claim. It's revolutionary. The logos is not a principle to be learned, but a person to be known and loved and worshiped and enjoyed. And that if you have Him, you have everything. In fact, the Scriptures tells us that everything we need for life and godliness is found in Jesus. And so we not get caught up thinking that this is just something that people think out there. Let's be clear that these two mindsets of life is about being a good person or life is about enjoying everything in the moment, we've kind of mixed those with Christianity too. We find those same mindsets in the church. In fact, I find those same mindsets oftentimes in my way of thinking, that I'll catch myself thinking those things. And so the way we do it in the church is we say that there's no way to the Father but through Jesus. It's all through grace. It's all through faith. You have to put your faith in Jesus and you can be saved, and you will not have to spend eternity in hell, but you can spend eternity with God in heaven. So let's do that. Now be a good person. Right? Be as good as you can be. That's the goal of Christianity, just to be a good, nice person. Or we come over here and we say, well, kind of one of two ways. Either one, Jesus has forgiven me of all my sins, so I can do whatever I want, and Jesus will forgive me. In fact, I was talking to a friend here recently, and they said that they did something that was not illegal, but against the rules for where they were, kind of thing. And they said, well, I did ask Jesus for forgiveness before I did it. I don't think that's how it works. Right? Like, I know what I'm doing is wrong. Jesus, please forgive me. All right, let's go do it. Right? And so, but that's how we live much of the time. Right? Especially when it comes to kind of habitual sins in our life. It's how we tackle them a lot of times. Or we maybe have come to the conclusion that Jesus isn't all He's promised that He is because my life doesn't look like the way I want it to look. I'm not experiencing the joy that I should be experiencing. I'm not experiencing the comforts that I should be experiencing. And so we write Jesus off as a liar or a fraud because we've bought into the idea that life is about making the most of the moment and enjoying things to their fullest. I'd submit, and I think John would submit this morning, that as the Bible does call us to be good people, that's not the end goal. We follow Jesus, and we follow His example, and we follow His commands in our life. And on the other side, that God does want us to experience joy and contentment and satisfaction, but we look for it in other places that aren't Jesus, when God has said, here I am in the flesh. Let me be the source of your joy and your contentment. John the Apostle says, listen, there is an ideal world. And at Christmas, the ideal becomes real. See, we oftentimes, we have this idea of you can be an idealist or a realist, right? And so most of us in here would probably put ourselves in one of those two camps. Probably most of us would put ourselves in the realist camp because we all think we're realists. All right? And the realists who are really idealists think the other realists are pessimists. Right? We all put ourselves, because we all think we're in the real, but we recognize that there is an idea, and a deal, and at Christmas time, we see God punches a hole in the wall between the ideal and the real. The ideal becomes real. God becomes flesh. And He erases the problem of meaninglessness in our lives. Because if we can look and we say, look, there is a purpose, there is a logos for us, and His name is Jesus, then everything in our life can align with that, and we have purpose, and we have meaning, and there is a rationale for getting up in the morning. We can't keep him on the peripheral of our life once we recognize that he is the Logos. So some questions for us this morning as we think through this, so we don't get too abstract. Is Jesus the reason for getting up in the morning for you? Is he the one whom around everything in your life revolves? Are his desires and his will and his love for you the things that help you make your decisions? Does he have the highest priority in your life? So if we really understand Jesus as the Logos, that he is what gives life meaning, we put him at the center, then we begin to experience the blessings as a result of that. So this morning, my question for you, if you're struggling with meaning and purpose in life, is Jesus your Logos? Do you come to him, for example, only when there's trouble? Maybe you're here this morning, you've been attending church lately, or you're attending this morning because you've got some troubles in your life and you want Jesus to do something about those troubles. But the reality is, if that's the case, then you're just using Jesus to accomplish what the real Logos in your life is, what the real center is. Your goals are in the center and he's on the periphery. But Jesus calls us to make him the center of our life, that we experience meaning and purpose and have a rationale for life that actually makes sense. Another blessing that flows out of the incarnation, not just the end to the problem of meaninglessness, but also the end to a problem of guilt. The fact is that if Jesus is God and man, that's the only way to deal with your guilt. Because if we don't center our lives on him, if we don't give him the mastery that he deserves, then it's a crime. He's our creator. He's bought and paid for us. And so to not give him lordship over our life is rebellion against him. The Bible says we should be punished for that rebellion. But it also says that Jesus came to die on our behalf so that God can completely accept us. And Jesus has to be God and man to do that. On one hand, he has to be man because who else could suffer and die for man other than a human being? On the other hand, he has to be God because his death then is of infinite value. See, some of us in here have some things in our life that we just can't get away from. And that guilt just kind of stays on us and weighs us down and rides us out. If you're a Shakespeare fan, maybe you may remember Lady Macbeth, who would see the blood on her hands even though no one else could see it, and was constantly trying to wash her hands to get the stain off. And that you're going through life with that kind of mindset, that there's this stain that's there that you're trying to get rid of and try to rid yourself of, but it just won't go away. You have guilt in you and on your soul that you haven't been able to deal with. Some of this may be false guilt because of things friends or people or parents have said to you in the past or about you. You've never been able to get rid of it. Some of it is true guilt. You've cheated in certain places. You've violated trust. You've betrayed things. You've violated standards. And maybe a problem for you is you go back and forth. Some people tell you, well, that's false guilt. And some people tell you, no, that's true guilt. And you don't even really know where to start. Let me tell you this morning to start with Jesus. At Christmas, look at Jesus twice to deal with your guilt. First, look at him as God. This is an infinite God who died on your behalf. See, one of the mindsets we get into when it comes to living with guilt is that this offense, whatever it is too big for God to forgive. He can't forgive me because of it's too big, or it happened too long, or it was too many times, that God cannot forgive. But in Acts chapter 20, when it talks about the church of God, this is what it says, which he bought with his own blood. The blood of God. Let me ask you, what is the blood of God worth? It would be worth an infinite value. Not even something that we could begin to put a price tag on, to the point where if there were 20 billion of you with your life and record on 20 billion different planets, Christ's blood is worth infinitely more than that debt could have accumulated. Because He's an infinite God, His death has infinite value, which means it covers all your sin. You can look at Him and you can be free because God died for you. But He's also man. He understands. He knows what it's like. The writer of Hebrews tells us this, where he says, look, we have a high priest that's able to understand what we go through, was tempted in every way that we were, yet was without sin. So the other way we often hold on to our guilt and hold Jesus at bay is by thinking He won't understand. But the Bible tells us that He was man, that He understands what we were tempted with. So if you want freedom from your guilt, from that spot that you can't wash away, there it is in Jesus. There's a freedom. John said, from this fullness we've received blessing upon blessing, grace upon grace. If you believe in the miracle of Christmas and you base your life on it, then there's no end to the miracles that can come into your life, even erasing the guilt that you live with. And then lastly, if Christmas ends the problem of meaninglessness and ends the problem of guilt, then it ends the problem of hopelessness. Listen to what the psalmist in Psalm 130, verse 7, he says, O Israel, hope in the Lord. For with the Lord there is steadfast love, and listen to this part, and with Him is plentiful redemption. That there is hope, not just for this life, but for life everlasting. So as concluding this morning, how do we make sure we get the miracle of Christmas in our life? How do you make sure that you really build your life on Christmas? And so all of this comes, this having purpose in life, being able to be free from your guilt, being able to have hope. Look at verse 17 in John chapter 1. It says, for the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. Do you know what that means? One thing we know from all the nativity stories is that only humble people got invited to His birth. There were shepherds who were in the field who were humble by their position in life. They were humble. They got the birth announcement. God held the birth of Jesus coming into the world in a stable. And there's some people who just don't go into stables. It's kind of humiliating to be in there with all the muck and the mire. But the Bible would say that the way that we find meaning, the way that we find freedom from our guilt, the way that we find hope in our life is through Jesus. Not through the law, not by keeping a regiment, not by keeping a routine, not by being religious enough or being good enough, but by humbling ourselves to say, Jesus, I cannot do this. I need You. You are the only thing that makes sense. I cannot possibly make myself worthy through the law, through efforts, through striving. That we need Jesus to do the work that we cannot do. Some of you may be here this morning and say, look, I've received Jesus as Savior, but I'll tell you something, I don't see all the blessings that you're talking about in my life. Let me give you a reason why. Jesus is God. We've looked at that this morning. He claimed to be God. Those close to Him claimed that He was God. Jesus is God, but do you treat Him as God? Do you act toward Him as if He is God? God is an infinite person. We saw that. He's limitless. Limitless. Your problem in many cases is that you're limiting what God can do in your life. For example, some of you don't believe that there's things in your life that He can change. And John reminds us this morning that, hey, the Logos became flesh. That Jesus is God. That He can change anything. He can work in your life to bring hope. He can work in your life to bring freedom from addictions. He can work in your life to bring joy. He can work in your life to bring reconciliation. Maybe the reason you're not experiencing some of the blessings of Christmas is you're not believing that Jesus is God. One of the reasons that we may not be willing to give Jesus every part of our life is because we say, if I really come to Christ, I may have to give up this relationship or this practice or this part of my life. I know it's probably not right. I don't want to give it up. I'm afraid if I give myself to Him all the way, I'm afraid that if I obey Him flat out with all of my life, then I'll miss out in some way. Just stand back for a second with me and think that through and look through this. This is kind of cosmic for us, but we got to get way back to be able to see it, away from ourselves. But think about it. Who built your joy sensors? Who built you in the way that you would be satisfied by some things and continually longing for more in other things? Who designed you? Who created you? John chapter 1 says, Jesus. That He made everything. That God is your creator, and therefore He created the things that are meant to bring joy to you, that you would receive and understand and sense. This is joy. The things that are meant to satisfy, that God created you in such a way that you would be satisfied by certain things and continued longing when you tried to be satisfied with others. Psalm 16 says this, as David writes a prayer. He says, in your face, talking about God, in God's face is fullness of joy. And your right hand are pleasures forevermore. I mean, do we really believe the lie that there is somebody less than God that is going to be able to meet those joys in our life and help us be satisfied fully? Do you think that if He comes into your life and you give yourself to Him and He gives Himself to you, that somehow you're going to be missing out on the things that are going to bring pleasure and satisfaction and happiness in your life? See, if Jesus is really God, the only thing that makes sense is for us to give ourselves to Him fully. See, it doesn't happen by being a little bit more religious. See, when someone comes to us and says, I'm God, I created you, give me your whole life, that makes sense. To say, I'm God, I created you, try to be a little bit better. Like that doesn't even make sense. Be a little bit more religious. That would be acting crazy. It's not what Jesus said. The only way to respond to a person who says that he's God is to hate Him, fear Him, or fall down at His feet and give Him everything. It's the only things that make sense. So the question for you this morning is, which one of those will be you? You can hate God and push Him away. You may be here this morning and that's kind of the posture you've been taking with God. Keep Him away. Keep Him as far away as you can. You can fear Him and run away. Or you could fall down at His feet to worship Him and find meaning, find freedom from guilt, and find hope in your life. Let's pray.